Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Seeker session. And let's say hi to Jay Coakley. Jay, how are you?
Hello, Mark. Doing great. It's always good to be here.
Good, nice to see you. So it's the final program of the year. So I really wanted to look at a big question that goes to the heart of how we live our lives. And the question is, how can we live with what we know? We have so much knowledge coming at us at all times these days. How can we thrive, keep our faith, keep our sanity, and continue to heal and learn and grow in this complicated world that's so full of what seem to be insurmountable challenges and problems that defy solutions? How is it possible to create a modicum of harmony amidst all the discord and learn to forgive terrible things when it seems just beyond our ability? In our era of hyperpolarization, it's so tempting to collapse in despair or imagine that there's really no way forward, that the mess we're in is simply unprecedented. But that is not true. While there are certain dangers, such as the ones facing our climate, that are new, the principles underlying our extreme divisions have a long history in nearly every part of the world. Addressing our fear and uncertainty, it's very helpful to consider how other people in other times have fared in the presence of extreme division, and to look at their wisdom strategies for moving through periods of polarization and group hatred against the most appalling odds. For example, think of the survivors of apartheid in South Africa who faced the odds of overcoming their bloody past and sustaining their individual and communal spirits when the yoke of white oppression was finally lifted. There's a story about this that I find extremely moving. It's about an ex-apartheid honcho named Eugene de Kock. One day in Pretoria Central Prison in South Africa, de Kock made a surprising request of his captors in this place where he was serving a life sentence. He was one of the most notorious, vicious murderers of the apartheid regime. But de Kock in prison had undergone a dramatic spiritual conversion, and he wanted to personally apologize to the widows of his victims. He asked that the meeting be held in private, and to everyone's surprise, the attorney for two of the widows agreed to his terms. So one morning in 1997, Pearl Faku and Doreen Moduka arrived at the prison to meet the man who had killed their husbands. Sitting with the widows, de Kock expressed his extreme contrition and his excruciating shame. He told them, "I was raised to think of you as animals," and then he broke down in uncontrollable sobs. Shortly after the meeting, Mrs. Faku and Moduko described their rendezvous to a psychologist. And they said that de Kock, who was considered to be a monster of mythic repute, astonished them by communicating how deeply he regretted what he had done, as well as the pain that he'd caused their families. And Mrs. Faku found herself unexpectedly moved by the spectacle of his genuine remorse. As she told the psychologist, "I was profoundly touched by him." And then she reported doing something that shocked not only de Kock, but Mrs. Faku herself. She reached out and took his hand. It was his trigger hand, he told her in tears, the hand that he'd used to kill so many Black people. She explained, "I was so moved by his pain. I related to him in the only way one does in such circumstances. I touched his hand." The other widow, Mrs. Moduko, continued, quote, "If showing compassion to our enemies is something that our bodies recoil from, what should our attitude be to their cries for mercy? The cries that tell us that their hearts are breaking and that they are willing to renounce their past and their role in it," unquote. In other words, she was implying, how can we forgive unforgivable things? Mrs. Faku continued, quote, "I hope that when he sees our tears, he knows that they are not only tears for our husbands, but tears for him as well. I would like to hold him by the hand and show him that there is a future and that he can still change," unquote. So disturbing as the memory of having touched him was, this experience was an awakening for the widows as well. It made them realize something that they were not prepared for. As Mrs. Faku put it, I learned that good and evil exist in all our lives, and that evil, like good, is always a possibility. So this is an extremely important point for all of us on a path of awakening. The awareness that each of us contains the seeds of all possible crimes, and that we're capable of behaving in abysmal ways given the right conditions. That awareness levels the human playing field, spiritually speaking. It teaches us humility. It relaxes self-righteousness. It deepens compassion. And it opens the door to the possibility of forgiveness, which has nothing to do with condoning evil and everything to do with the transformative, sometimes shocking power of love. The great Russian novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn captured this paradoxical truth very well in his novel, The Gulag Archipelago. He wrote, quote, "If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" Unquote. Isn't that great? The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Forgiveness requires intention, and it also requires strength. Ordinarily, anger, pain, and fear kind of herd us back and forth between shifting camps of good versus evil. But when sacred awareness of our shared humanity takes place, a third type of response becomes possible, one that's more expansive than the polarity of us versus them. In this spiritual dimension, we're all in this human lifeboat together, doing our best. As the poet W.H. Auden put it, loving our crooked neighbors with all our crooked heart. When we recognize ourselves in our enemies, the dualistic mind is turned around. The Greeks called this metanoia, and it permits us to countenance human complexity without protecting ourselves from what we don't want to see. The widows in South Africa learned it that day in prison with de Kock. Weeping when they saw his tears, they stepped across the abyss of grief and touched into sacred reality. There's a wonderful story from the Iliad about this. Near the end of the Trojan War, Achilles, the famous warrior, decided to pull his troops out of the conflict. And in the course of the ensuing scuffle, his beloved friend Patroclus was killed by the Trojan prince Hector. Achilles lost his mind with grief and rage and revenge. He murdered Hector, he mutilated his corpse, and he refused to give the body back to the family for burial. One night, Hector's father, Priam, who was the king of Troy, put on a disguise and slipped into the Greek camp incognito. Priam made his way to Achilles' tent to ask for the body of his son. Seeing the old man, Achilles thought of his own father and began to weep. At that moment, Priam looked at the man who had murdered so many of his sons, and he too began to weep. And as Homer wrote, the sound of their weeping filled the house. The Greeks believed that weeping together creates a bond between people. They believed that sharing grief dissolves the paper-thin boundary between the guilty and the innocent, and illuminates the shared truth that is common to both. In the Iliad, Achilles then takes the body of Hector and hands it to Priam very tenderly. And in that moment of compassion, the two men looked at one another and saw each other as divine. That is the kind of goodness we are capable of when we transcend naivete and self-righteousness, tribalism, and the call for revenge. It's the spiritual dimension that's afforded to us through humility and insight. Aware of our own clay feet, we reach upward beyond our own selfishness. This vertical movement is divine, whether you believe in a traditional God or not. This yearning to move beyond ourselves, what we call metaphysical experience, comes, as we talk a lot about in the Seekers Forum, from wiring in the human brain that has evolved to help us survive. We are born with a religious bent in the original sense of the Latin religio, to bind together. Without this unifying impulse, scientists tell us, we'd still just be tiny bands of Homo sapiens roaming around the planet without the ability to cohere or to congregate under a common roof. Fortunately, we are born with a mechanism for the suppression of our own selfishness for the sake of connection to this larger self. For example, studies of ritual indicate that they serve to bind participants together in metaphysical states of wonder, particularly those rituals that involve the kind of synchronized movements that are common to things like the whirling of the dervishes. People engaged in religious experience show decreased activity in the brain areas that maintain separation and set us apart as individuals. The sublimation of the separative self helps us to synchronize with those around us and to bind together in love. So, in answer to the question of how we live with what we know, the only response comes from having a conscious choice to love the world, including all our warts and adversities. As Mary Oliver put it in a poem, quote, "Except as we have loved, all news arrives as from a distant land. Except as we have loved, all news arrives as from a distant land." Until a person knows the experience of love, whether platonic or familiar, romantic, spiritual, she can hardly claim to be present in her own life. In fact, we can only know what we have loved. And the implication of this, that without opening to the world and others, we know nothing, is vital to anyone on a path of awakening. The author of The Little Prince, Saint-Exupéry, tells us famously that it is with the heart that one sees rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. It is with the heart that one sees rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. By opening our eyes to love, we enter into a spiritual path that is both steep and extremely rewarding. People who met Mother Teresa were sometimes puzzled by the enigma of this complicated woman's extreme compassion. What astonished them most was her ability to give and receive love and joy while holding, for example, a hopelessly ill infant. How could she bear the anguish of so many confrontations with sickness and death? She was often asked that. How can you do this without losing hope or faith? And her reply was that she was grateful for the ability to fulfill her soul's potential. As Mother Teresa was fond of saying, every suffering body she touched was, through the eyes of love, Christ in his distressing disguise. And when we look at Buddhism, we find a similar way of seeing. We're told, for example, by Buddhist teachers that the natural radiance of mind is its innate wakefulness, that the radiance of the mind is its wakefulness and vice versa. So it's the open, knowing nature of mind that seeks the higher, deeper connection that we're talking about. The Tibetan word for radiance also means able to know. So we come to realize as humans that our mandate is unique and it is awesome. The mandate to know ourselves as part of a vast cosmos that we can conceptualize and then mirror in our imagination with feelings of cosmic unity. No other animal on the planet can do this. Monkeys stare at the moon, but only we have Rumi. Only we have mystery and sacredness, imagination, mirror neurons in the brain that enable us to empathize with other sentient beings. Without this ability, without self-awareness, compassion and awe would be impossible. It's this reverence for life itself that makes a Mother Teresa or a Doris Faku or a Buddha possible. The window onto our shared reality brightens our self-absorbed lives and reminds us that no matter how painful our existence can be, and it is also miraculous. So this sacred sense reminds us that the surface of life, the superficial facts of existence, are a fraction of what lies underneath. We're defined by our dreams as much as by our DNA and by how we choose to transcend our own limits. Whether you're an atheist or a true believer, you can sacramentalize your life by remaining alert to wonder, to interconnection, and also to what the author Karen Armstrong calls human-heartedness. Human-heartedness. As Armstrong puts it, you must have concern for everybody. God formed you into tribes and nations so you may know one another. Isn't that great? So antithetical to what most of us believe. We think of tribes as things that are separate and necessarily adversarial. But the idea that we were formed into tribes and nations in order that we might know one another is radical and revolutionary. And it's a lesson that is mostly ignored in a secular materialist culture. But it's one that has to be emphasized, remembered, if we are to keep our spirits intact. Our guest interview this month, Francis Weller, speaks very eloquently about this process of restoring soul to our culture and how it is that soulfulness can transform grief, anger, judgment, and blame into love. And that is the work before us, every one of us today. It's an alchemical mandate to transform darkness to light and to forge bonds of compassion from the rifts of hatred. And that brings us back to where we began, to forgiveness and reconciliation and laying down the sword of separation that we use to sever our connection from other people. The truth is that nothing else will lighten our load at the end of the day, except reconciliation. Much as we might like to cling to our superior positions and keep the other at an arm's length, this alienation is unsustainable as a long-term strategy in a globalized world. It's simply a recipe for disaster. And the sooner we accept that, the faster our spiritual recovery as a species is going to take place. So that's what I wanted to say to you tonight about the holy question. And now we will move into 15 minutes of writing. Jay, could you pull up the prompt? Here we go. I'd like you now to take 15 minutes to write about when self-righteousness, tribalism, and moral superiority obstruct your ability to love as well as your self-awareness. Okay, when do self-righteousness, tribalism, and moral superiority get in the way of your heart's opening and your knowing yourself? We're going to take 15 minutes to do that, please, and then we'll come back together as a group.